Hi, here we are with our first type of argument, the argument of fact. Seems kind of oxymoronic, doesn't it? I mean, if something's a fact, that means it can't be argued, right? Well, the argument of fact is really about how we interpret facts. What facts are important and what facts are maybe not important in the creation of that interpretation. The argument of fact essentially argues that a condition does exist currently, has existed in the past, or will exist in the future, kind of a prediction type. Okay. Now, in our textbook, the two major chapters that cover this are Chapter 8, which is the argument of fact chapter, and also Chapter 4, arguments based on facts and reason, logos. Okay. But let me begin in Chapter 1, where it states the arguments of fact. Did something happen? There's no point in arguing a case until its basic facts are established. So the argument of fact usually involves a statement that can be proved or disproved with specific evidence or testimony. Now, one of the classic examples that I like to use to describe the argument of fact is the issue of climate change. So that's an issue, climate change. Some people would argue climate change is indeed occurring. Okay, how do you prove that? You have to have a collection of facts. Okay? Facts from credible resources, people who study this issue, people who have published in academic fields, academic sources, right, in this field. And they have looked at lots and lots of evidence, and they come to a certain conclusion. There are people who may disagree. Now, you can disagree to be disagreeable. That's, however, kind of intellectually irrelevant. On the other hand, if you say, wait, look at these facts, look at this information, look at this data, which also comes from credible, reliable sources, then you can say, looking at this, I conclude, no, climate change is not real. It's not happening. Okay, or it's not happening in this way, whatever you might conclude. Okay. So the argument of fact argues that a condition does exist now, something is happening now, has happened in the past. Okay. So a great example that I like to use is when people talk about how the dinosaurs became extinct. Okay. Now, there are different theories about how the dinosaurs became extinct. And it's not because some people have access to data that other people do not have access to. Okay. Everybody has access to all the same data, at least all the people who are studying this issue. It's that they conclude, based on looking at the data, that certain things tell them one thing. Other people look at that same data and say, no, it tells them something else. Okay? Now, generally speaking, right, as long as everybody has access to the same data, over time, things tend to, shall we say, coalesce around a certain theory or maybe group of theories. But, for example, with the dinosaurs, since it's so far in the past, the data may be insufficient to really come to a definitive conclusion, so you still have arguments that are going on. On the other hand, looking the other direction, the future. Well, nobody knows what's going to happen in the future for sure until the future actually occurs. Nevertheless, you can still make arguments about what will happen in the future. So, going back to climate change as a simple example, somebody may argue in the future, this is what's going to occur, blah, blah, blah. And they do that, again, based on looking at data in front of them and then saying, this data tells me this. Somebody else could look at the data or different data, again, it has to all be credible data, and say, no, this is what I predict for the future. Now, that argument won't be settled until the future actually occurs. But again, as you get more and more data, right, you can generally see certain theories become stronger, other ones kind of fall away, right? Now, the thing about the argument of fact is it's often the basis of other arguments that occur later on, especially the argument of policy, which is the argument that we'll finish our semester with. So it's very important that we get, shall we say, pretty good with the notion of argument of fact, okay? That is why chapter 4 in our book is so important, where it talks about arguments based on facts and reason. Why? Because you have to have good, solid facts, okay? And wow, has there ever been a time, well, there probably has been times, but more recently, has there ever been a time when there's been so much argument about what is even simply a fact, right? Did Donald Trump lose the election, or was there fraud, for example, right? Well, some of the times people are looking at facts fairly, and other times people are looking at facts with a strong level of bias. That bias, of course, is what gets in the way of making a solid argument of fact. Okay, where you say, well, I'm not going to look at this information, or I'm not going to look at that information, right? And we seem to be living in a time when we have more of that going on than I've ever seen before. But nevertheless, there we go. We live in the time that we live in, and we have to deal with it. So if you go through chapter 4, it will talk about facts, logic, reason, right? It will talk about what is strong, stronger, weaker, right? So for instance, what's the weakest element in an argument? One of the things I might argue is personal experience. Now you might say, hey, wait a minute, but it happened. It happened to me. It happened to my friend. It happened to my family. Yeah, maybe. But it might have only been just you, right? So in other words, it might be something that is an outlier, something unusual, right? Or you might misinterpret what happened. That's why personal experience often tends to be one of the weaker forms of argument in a fact argument, right? Now, on the other hand, if you gather lots of people together through surveys, polls, studies, research done on a large scale, who all have the same kind of problem or experience, that then becomes something more substantial, right? That becomes something more substantial. And that's why in this class, we don't use personal experience for arguments of fact, unless it's just something to like create a hook at the beginning of your paper. Say, hey, you know, this happened to my great aunt or something like that, okay? But be very careful as you read chapter 4 to see about the kinds of arguments that make for strong arguments of fact, right? You have to reach out to those, you know, those types of sources. Then we're putting them together in the overall argument of fact as detailed in chapter 8, okay? So when we explore chapter 8 in our textbook, right, condition does exist, has existed, will exist, right? You have a background of support. Right? You can bring it together and you say, okay, here's what this is really going to be all about, right? So, a condition does exist. Something's happening now that can be proven on a factual basis. Has existed in the past, right? And again, you know, it could be something as far back as the dinosaurs, could be something in the much more recent past, or an argument for the future based on what we know today, right? Those are the three major types of argument. I encourage you to look at the handout that is on the fact module that shows some sample topics that will help to illustrate what I'm talking about here. Keep in mind that this is not intended, that list is not intended to be an exclusionary list, a limiting list. It's just something you can start thinking about so you come up with your own ideas. I don't expect you to stick to the topics that are on that list. That would be very, very limiting and very, very boring, ultimately, actually. So, good luck with this opening paper. It's very important that we understand how to make an argument a fact. As I said, it tends to be the basis for later arguments. So we need to be able to do this first. Thank you.